Hello and welcome to Dateline London. I'm Anita McVeigh, and this week we assess the diplomatic efforts going on to persuade President Putin not to invade Ukraine. We also look at the alarming rise in the cost of living and compare what governments are doing to try to ease the pressure. And I'll find out from my guests which stories they think we ought to be getting more of our attention. I'm joined by the London correspondent of the Sydney Morning Herald, Latika Burke, Henry Chu of the Los Angeles Times, and in the studio with me this evening, the BBC special correspondent Clive Murray. Welcome to you all. So let's begin with Ukraine and that question of whether diplomacy can work, even as Russia starts large-scale military drills with neighbouring Belarus, while the USA and other countries have told their citizens in Ukraine to leave the country as soon as possible. All interested parties say there's a will to continue talks and a will to negotiate. Russia's main focus, it seems, is still on the US. And crucially, Russia has yet again emphasised that it feels its security concerns around potential NATO expansion have not been answered. After talks involving a number of world leaders hosted by President Biden, NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said they stood united and prepared for any scenario and remained open for dialogue. Well, Henry, may I start with you? Is this intense diplomacy, Henry, getting us anywhere? We've just heard from the US that it believes the world is now in the window very much where action by Russia could begin potentially, according to President Biden's national security advisor, even before the Winter Olympics end.
Well, to the extent that bullets are not yet flying and no blood has been shed, that's a good thing. And I think the more talking that can be done, the better, to try to put that prospect far off or prevent it altogether. But we also need to just look what's happening on the ground during this time that these negotiations have been happening. You have now Ukraine almost encircled on all four sides, north, south, and east, by Russian forces, by land and by sea. The forces are in easy striking distance of Kiev, certainly from Belarus, where they've been conducting joint military drills. And that's just allowed President Putin in Russia to keep on piling on the pressure, making this invasion look like it could happen at any moment and getting a position for such a thing. And on the other side, to the west, you've got NATO and the US deploying more troops, sending more of them to frontline eastern flank areas of the alliance. And now the two are locked in this dance where, if we're not careful, through its own inexorable logic, it would take us right off the cliff. Now, in terms of the talking has achieved, let's remember that for President Putin, he could be playing a very long game. When you've set yourself up to be leader pretty much for life, you can afford to take a very long view. And what he's already done is have these other countries that he thinks of as antagonists dancing attendance upon him. The flurry of meetings at very high levels with countries that had shut Russia out or ignored it to a certain degree is staggering. And now Russia is receiving the attention that Moscow thinks it rightly deserves. You have that happening, and you also have the allies, though for all their professions of unity, have had to do a lot of talking to see what measures they're willing to impose and sacrifices they're willing to put up with in case of a Russian invasion. And of course, the government in Kiev is being undermined daily by misinformation by Russia and by morale sapping through all this talk of invasion. So certainly Putin has achieved something with dragging this crisis out as much as possible.
Latika, one suggestion has been in all the diplomacy that Ukraine adopts a neutral position. And do you think that ultimately that is where the diplomacy might be heading, even though that on the face of it seems contradictory with the idea of Ukraine determining its future, and it has expressed that desire to at some point join NATO?
Yes, I think Ukraine has made it very clear where its fortunes lie, and that's with NATO, not as a neutral state. But either way, it does look like diplomacy is running out. There's been a really serious escalation in the rhetoric from both Britain and from the United States that we heard there from Jake Sullivan just in the last 2 hours, Boris Johnson telling his counterparts of Poland, Germany, Italy, NATO, the European Commission and the United States, of course, that he now fears for Europe's security. That wasn't even the message that we were hearing from the British government just a few hours ago. Ben Wallace was in Moscow, he's the Defence Secretary, and he was saying that actually cooperation had gone from below zero to above zero, or about zero to above zero. So not a huge amount of progress, but you can see in this climate that they'll bank anything. Whether that's been enough, of course, the next 2 days I think will show. But this is the first time that we have seen the United States actually put a time frame on when they think the invasion could occur. And we're seeing US media well-informed reports saying that the invasion could occur in the next 2 days. So diplomacy, neutrality for Ukraine, I think that time is up.
Interesting. Latika, Clive there thinking that time is up for diplomacy. What's your view on that? Clearly the situation as outlined by the White House is very, very dangerous. They're warning of what they call false flags, an incident which Russia uses to start something, trying to blame Ukraine for starting military action. But do you think that this rhetoric, this brinkmanship, if you want to call it that, is part of the natural evolution of the diplomacy in this process?
Ukraine is a huge country that the Russians, if they do invade, are going to have to try to subdue. And as a result, you need to have the right assets in place in order to do that, to carry out an invasion. They can move pretty quickly from Belarus straight down. The road goes straight into Kiev, the capital. Wouldn't take that long. But they'd have to hold the country, and that could result in the kind of counterinsurgency with body bags heading back to Moscow that Putin does not want to see. I think what the West has realized is that Putin's assets are now in place. He's been building up these forces over the last several days and several weeks. The assets are in place now in order to launch the kind of invasion that could subdue the country. But that doesn't mean Putin has decided he is actually going to invade. And I think that's a very critical point to make. I just heard Sir Christopher Mayer, former ambassador, UK ambassador to Washington, saying that he still cannot believe Putin will do this because it would be the most stupid thing to do. The Ukrainians are going to fight. Weapons are flooding in from the French, from the British. We've got NATO troops stationed in Poland and Romania and other countries nearby. It will be a bloody affair. Putin is still, I suspect, hoping that he can get the kind of assurances that he's been looking for from the beginning by having all the assets in place. I don't think we're as close to war as the Americans are pointing out. All the Americans are saying, and Boris Johnson, the others, all they're saying is if he wanted to do it now, he could do it now.
Interesting to get those different views. And just to conclude this section of the programme, Henry, back to you. Someone I spoke to recently about Ukraine, an expert on the country, was talking about the jaw war rather than the war. So the talking. So do you think that is what President Putin is trying to do at the moment? Ramp up the pressure, the physical pressure, to extract more concessions?
We know that Putin is a very calculated leader, and he knows full well that the minute there is an invasion, everything resets, right? So some of the concessions that he's been hoping for in the talks with US and NATO, which he hasn't gotten yet, there at least have been some moves towards saying that there would be negotiations over the security architecture in Europe. It wouldn't be exactly what he would want in terms of complete banishment of Ukraine and other countries from ever joining NATO. But as I said, the minute there are boots on the ground in Ukraine, all of that goes off the table. And any of those advantages or gains that he would hope to have made would be completely evaporate and get blown up. So I think he does realize that he needs to have pressure in order to get people to the table. And he's willing to keep turning the screws until such time as that at least gets to some point of satisfaction for him. It doesn't mean that there won't be an invasion, but he still has time to let this play out and see if he can wrest some concessions from the West.
OK, well, let's move on now to our next topic in this Dateline. Energy costs up, food costs up, taxes up, inflation up. We've been talking about the cost of living crisis in the UK a lot, and this crisis is also global. So what are governments around the world doing to help people cope? Latika, let's begin with you on this and tell us what the Australian government is doing.
Well, inflation in Australia is at around 3.5%. Now, that doesn't sound that high compared to the inflation jumps we're seeing in the United States and here in the UK. But for an Australian perspective, it's actually very high. It's the highest or fastest pace of growth since 2014. And in Australia, the cost of living is already extremely expensive. Salaries are very high, but the cost of living is subsequently also extremely high. So this is a really potent political issue heading into an election, which Australia is facing within the next 3 months. And what we will see, I expect, is the government announce some consumer feel-good policies. The trouble is previous governments have tried this and they don't really work. Energy prices are one real pressure point in Australia. The government there has brought on some more hydropower to try and ease pricing. But with housing and petrol prices now at record highs in Australia, any relief there is going to be quickly gobbled up. Interestingly, on housing in New South Wales, where Sydney is the capital, the state premier there is actually just going to announce today this new scheme whereby they can give equity to the state government and help first-time home buyers to then acquire their first house. And even a situation where parents could give over some of their equity to the government and help their kids get on the housing ladder. So there are some radical schemes in the works, but the cost of living in Australia is always an electoral killer. And I think that could be a big sleeper issue heading into the election in May.
And Clive, it's difficult to see how any schemes, whatever government comes up with them, will do a significant amount to ease the immediate pressure on people, and that's certainly the case here in the UK, isn't it?
It is. I mean, you've got the Scottish Government, for instance, having a one-off £150 payment to people who are suffering from fuel poverty. So the lowest income families will get that kind of one-off help. £350 again to those in fuel poverty in England as well. But some of that has to be paid back to the government. So you've got these one-off payments which will help in the short term, but longer term, it's about getting down inflation, which is heading towards the 7.5% figure that the Bank of England reckons it will be around April time. You've got an increase in taxes in national insurance coming. You've got the increase in the fuel cap as well, which had kept energy prices down for ordinary people. It's very, very difficult indeed. But one suggestion that's been put forward by the opposition Labour Party is a wealth tax, a tax on those companies that have made huge profits from extracting oil and gas. BP had huge profits, a windfall tax. BP had huge profits. They announced £10 billion, I think, earlier this week in profits. Shell last week announced huge profits as well. And the suggestion is there should be a one-off tax on these companies to help with the national economic picture. The criticism of that is that it doesn't really help with supply, and it's the supply issues longer term that are causing energy prices to go through the roof, and as a result causing the squeeze on ordinary families. Consequently, how do you deal with all this? You've just got to hope that at some point energy prices come down, and that will have a leavening effect on the overall economy generally.
Although many experts think that won't happen, oil prices coming down for some time. And some countries are imposing that windfall tax, aren't they, on oil giants like France, for example. Henry, talk to us about the States then. What's happening there? What is President Biden doing there to try to help hard-pressed people? I mean, I know one of the big areas that he's been looking at is ramping up infrastructure to create more jobs and so on. But give us a broader sense of what it's like in the States at the moment.
I was just there a few weeks ago, and indeed, the pinch on people's wallets is really becoming quite felt now. There's one estimate out there that in the month of January, the average household was looking at a rise in expenditure of about $275, which is a really hefty punch to the gut for many families, working families particularly, who are just getting by. And now you have gas prices, as we're talking about, going up. There's a sort of a totemic amount in the U.S., which is $3 per gallon. It's breached that in many places. It's come down in a few areas, but still it's hovering at a cost that many Americans find extremely hurtful. And what we saw with inflation of now 7.5%, we've hit that figure in the US that Britain says it's heading towards. It's the biggest jump in 40 years. And what happened in the last month wasn't just because of supply disruption. We've talked a lot about supply chains being cut because of the pandemic. But this time, what was driving inflation were rises in the cost of food, of electricity, and also of shelter. Apartment rents were going up, for example. And so it's really hitting people where it hurts. Now, this infrastructure package you talked about is something that actually finally was passed by the Biden administration and by Congress, and that will hopefully bring jobs in many areas where there's a lot of deprivation and also failing infrastructure, which of course makes a feedback loop with poverty. But a larger package that the government has been trying to put through is what's known as the Build Back Better bill, which is more about social welfare, which would include real relief for these pocketbook issues, such as more child care help, bringing down the cost of drugs and medicine. But this package has been completely gummed up in Congress, and not just by Republicans, who we know to a person will oppose it because it's coming from President Biden, but from some of his own Democrats, including Joe Manchin in Virginia and Kristen Sinema in Arizona. And until that obstacle can be overcome, I think a lot of Americans will go on hurting. And that's actually fine for the GOP because we've got midterm elections coming up in November. And as Latika was saying, is the case for Australia, cost of living rises, and what feels like a real downside for American purses is deadly for any ruling party. And so the Republicans would certainly not be averse to seeing more of this pain go on in terms of electoral advantage.
And Latika, here in the UK, this cost of living crisis has often been crystallised with the image of people having to choose between food or fuel. And I just wonder, is the squeeze as intense as that in Australia?
Well, it varies. I mean, Australia does have a very good social safety net, so it's never, in my mind, as acute as some of the shortages that you do see in the UK. But certainly housing, I think, is the big killer. You have a generation now that just cannot afford to buy a house. And with that comes, little hope in their future. It's fewer investment in capital and the feeling that they belong to the economy and that they therefore want the economy to grow and thrive. And if you separate these generations from the economy, I think that's the longer term generational issue that you have.
And that's a big challenge here in the UK for the government. Levelling up, we hear the UK government talking about, the Westminster government talking about all the time. And that's the big challenge for them to deliver on that, isn't it?
Yeah, because you've got to have money to deliver on all of that. And we've already seen the government cut back on some of the attempts to improve the infrastructure, particularly rail, in parts of the north of England, those areas that voted for Boris Johnson in the last election, that were expecting some kind of dividend as a result of all of that. You've got to have an economy that's robust and strong. And the GDP figures today actually suggested that the British economy is rebounding and doing pretty well. Boris Johnson, the trick for him, if, of course, he gets over his current problems concerning investigations into lockdown parties at Downing Street, if he hangs on to power, the trick for him is somehow balancing the competing interests of those people in the north of England that he needs to support, as well as keeping the economy on track, given the amount of money that's been borrowed in order to cope with the COVID pandemic.
So challenges for governments everywhere to try to help people with the cost of living crisis. Well, finally, let me ask all three of you to tell us of a story that you think we ought to be hearing more about, but currently aren't. Latika, I'll begin with you.
Well, today Antony Blinken was in Melbourne with the Quad foreign ministers, Maurice Payne of Australia and the foreign ministers of India and Japan, and it got lots and lots of attention. The news clips went everywhere. But there was a much more important, I think, or significant visit that should not go unnoticed that happened in Australia this week, and that was the foreign minister of Lithuania, who travelled to Canberra. Now, growing up in Australia, I don't think I ever heard anybody in my reporting or even in my personal life raise Lithuania as a country that anyone knew anything about or was remotely interested in or even really had a great relationship with in any way. But this week, Lithuania opened its first embassy in Canberra. And the reason for this is China, because China has been trying to economically coerce Lithuania in the same way that China has attacked and bullied Australia. And now you see these two countries forging a friendship, a relationship. They're going to work on trade. Australia's going to set up a trade office in Lithuania and try and help that tiny country maybe pick up some of its lost markets from China in Australia. So China really does have this knack of pushing people together and perhaps losing friends along the way.
Interesting. Well, I guess that's a story as old as time. You know, alliances shift, don't they? New alliances form. Henry, on to you. What should we be looking at in more detail?
I think what's happening now on the border between US and Canada is really quite remarkable. I mean, we are hearing some about it, and particularly in North America, perhaps less so.
We've talked about this quite a lot, so tell us why you think we ought to be looking at it even more closely.
Well, it's no longer just something that's happening in the U.S. and Canada, right? What's remarkable about it is how, because of the rise of social media, instant access to news and what's happening, this is really now something that has been spreading around the world. This kind of idea that through protest by lorry drivers or truckers, as we would say in the U.S., and blocking key infrastructure, that this could really bring governments to their knees. So you had this happening in Australia, certainly in New Zealand, where the parliament in Wellington was being besieged by a lot of truckers, and attempts at this in France. And there's even talk that perhaps in Vienna this is happening. So what I find really tricky about this situation, though, is that dissent in a democracy needs to be tolerated. It's important that people who have opposing views can express those views, sometimes even in ways that inconvenience others. And so you have now, though, a state of emergency in the state of Ontario, the province of Ontario in Canada, which is right across from Detroit. And it's now rippling across the border to affect the auto industry on both sides of the border. What will Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, do? Now, they're already talking about the possibility of cracking down more forcefully, perhaps bringing more police, maybe even military in to clear this away. But let's remember that Trudeau himself, when in India, farmers were blocking roads into New Delhi, he was the one who said that Canada would always be a supporter of free, dissenting and nonviolent dissenting opinion. So he really has something tricky on his hands, as will other governments if other lorry drivers or similar activists follow suit around the world.
Yeah, always interesting to see how governments manage those competing interests. And Clive, your pick?
Yeah, I would keep an eye on Kamila Valieva, 15 years old, Olympic ice skater for the Russian Olympic Committee, not for Russia, because Russia is banned from international competition. Now, Kamila Valieva, an amazing skater at that age. She was part of the winning group team for the Russian Olympic Committee. Earlier this week, she won the gold medal, but that medal has not been presented yet because Kamila Valieva was found to have had a banned substance in her sample in a competition in December. Now, the results of that have only just come out. The suggestion is that given that she's just 15, would she have on her own potentially taken a banned substance? The allegation is beginning to float out there now, and none of this has been substantiated, but this is why I'm saying we should keep an eye on this, is the suggestion that the Russian authorities are back to their own tricks in terms of wider scale use of banned substances. As I said, all allegations, all suggestions, but the idea that she has taken a banned substance of her own volition or on her own without anyone else being aware of it is something that people are going to start investigating. There could be a lot more to this than meets the eye. Yeah,
so the fundamental question at stake here is, I guess, Clive, whether a child, because she is a child, can be 15. Held culpable for something. Not talking necessarily specifically about this case, but as a generalisation, because as you're saying, these are all allegations. Can a child be held responsible for something like this?
Exactly.
Okay, Clive, really, really interesting to hear all of that. I think we've got time just to... Anything else you want to throw in, Latika or Henry? Just a minute to squeeze in any other stories you want to tell us about, Latika? Putting you on the spot, sorry.
You really put me on the spot. I think I might have hands up. Actually, no, there is a very good story actually in the Sydney Morning Herald this morning where Dawn Fraser, who is a great Olympian, has revealed that she stole not one but two Olympic flags in her career. And today she's just unveiled the Olympic flag she nicked from a games prior to the one that we all know about. So a bit of Aussie thievery on display there. But she's the athletes in Beijing have been advised not to follow that one this time around.
And Henry, in a line?
The Olympian Eileen Gu, American-born, but is actually skiing for China, and what that has meant for relations between the two sides.
Well, really interesting to hear you all finish off on Olympic stories. Thank you all so much, Latika Burke, Henry Chu, and of course, Clive Myrie. And that's it for Dateline London for this week. We're back next week at the same time. Goodbye.